So now let's move on to talk about how labor and employment affected different groups. Um, Several things to note. One is that African Americans and Latinos, they got better jobs than they had been given, even though discrimination still occurred. It was basically a time in our history when even those people who were discriminating basically realized the necessity of filling positions. Something that's also interesting is that women in the workforce increased by more than half, almost 60% of an increase of women being employed. Now, this created quite an issue for the family structure because a lot of men were away with the war. They were either off in combat or in a supportive role in the military somehow, whether intelligence or whether they were keeping the supply chains up or they were corpsmen, the medics. A lot of men were overseas. Actually, a lot of women were involved in the war effort as well. They were called WACs, the Women's Army Corps, and they went over in supportive roles a lot of times, whether as nurses or as helpers in the hospitals. But women back home, a lot of women back home were working in factories, trying to keep production up on important things. In your book, on page 741, they show a propaganda poster trying to get women to come into the factories. Um, and they portray them as soldiers. It says soldiers without guns. And they're portraying the women as just as important to the war effort as the men, which was true. I mean, it's very difficult to pull off a successful war if you don't have the supplies to do it. But it created a problem because you have a lot of children whose fathers are away with the war effort, and now their mothers are also away supporting the war effort by working in the factories. And there was limited childcare. I mean, daycare really, it wasn't quite as prevalent as it is today. That's an understatement. It wasn't prevalent at all. So a lot of times these kids would go to school during the school year, and then they were called latchkey kids. They would just let themselves in. Even younger children. They're also referred to more derogatorily as 8-hour orphans. And that was usually a term that was used by people who were against women working and leaving their kids at home. But this became an issue because you had some people that opposed women leaving their children at home unattended, but then the women also needed to work because you had to have people in the factories building the things that the military needed. You may think of, when you hear women in the workforce during World War II, of Rosie the Riveter. Rosie the Riveter is the quintessential working woman during World War II. You may have the mental picture of the woman flexing in the picture. If you don't know who Rosie the Riveter is, I strongly encourage you to look that up while you're doing your homework tonight. But it was basically, Rosie the Riveter was another propaganda poster used to show that women were strong and that women were strong enough to do the same jobs as men in the factories. But anyway, we see a large increase of African Americans in the factories. We see a large increase of Latin Americans and of women as well. Something interesting, just as a side note, the Zoot Suit riots, your book mentions them in passing. But if you want some interesting Latino history, Google the Zoot Suit riots. There was a song made in the late 90s called Zoot Suit Riot. And it's just a very brief reference. It doesn't really have anything to do with the riots, but they actually did occur in Los Angeles. So there, I think we all know what a Zoot Suit is, but check out the Zoot Suit riots if you're interested. Something else to note is that the mid-40s, toward the end of the war effort, is the beginning of the baby boom. So people are getting married younger because they have the money to do so. A lot of people are working and they're getting better jobs with better pay at a younger age. And so as a result, they're able to get married sooner. And as they're able to get married sooner, they're having families sooner. So really, the industrial boom that results from World War II is the beginning of the baby boom. So just a note of that. Okay, wartime life and culture. Wartime life and culture isn't really what you would think it would be during a war. I mean, a lot of times when a country's at war, I envisioned, anyway, before I knew about this, that people would be at home pining away for loved ones who couldn't be there, or they'd be fretting over the war effort. I remember with Desert Storm, I had an uncle who served, and we were always checking the news, watching to see what was going on with Desert Storm. Well, that was going on to an extent, but that wasn't the only thing going on as far as wartime life and culture. People had tons of money, tons more than they had before anyway. If you look at the growth of the GDP that I'd covered earlier, that GDP is going into the pockets of the workers, and the soldiers for that matter. However, the soldiers are away from home and they're not able to spend it. The people back home, they were spending money on things that were available, especially entertainment. You would see audiences, essentially half the population of movie-going age people in America would see a movie every week. Half of the population. I mean, if you look at people that attend movies every week in America today, it's nowhere near that. Now, you can argue that Netflix may have something to do with that, among other things. But even still, if you look before the advent of Netflix, that still wasn't that high of a number. And it was really a sense of escapism. You have the money, and you want to escape the idea of what's going on with the war. You want to enjoy yourself, kind of like the Great Depression, how the movie industry was booming during the Great Depression. People couldn't afford food, but they could afford a dime to go see a movie. So now people had lots of money. They were buying magazines like Life magazine. They were going to casinos, hotels, racetracks, dance halls, and they were just enjoying themselves back home. And really, you would think that this would be something that the soldiers wouldn't like. They would think, oh, here I am, I'm fighting the war effort, and you're over here having a good old time watching movies and dancing swing music and jazz. Well, that really actually wasn't how it was viewed a lot of times. A lot of times, the soldiers were glad to have something to think of back home. They associated the prosperity back home with something that they wanted to protect. So it was really a lot of times just thinking back home or reading a letter about a movie that one of their loved ones had seen, or food that they had eaten, or the comforts they were able to have that they were able to buy. Really, that was a comfort to a lot of the soldiers, just to know that existed back home. A soldier that was involved in Guadalcanal, there's a quote I want to read to you. He was saying that he was fighting for home. And then he said, quote, "Home is where the good things are. The generosity, the good pay, the comforts, the democracy, the pie." End quote. So he looked at home saying, home is where the good stuff is, and we're fighting to protect that. Now, the servicemen weren't without their entertainments. You may or may not have heard of the USO. But the USO was an organization that was started to help soldiers' morale. And they would recruit young women of good moral character to basically just be a companion for the soldiers, to sit and listen, to dance. They were basically just to entertain the soldiers. And notable entertainers as well would put on shows. So they would go overseas as a representative of the USO, and they would put on a show for the soldiers. And the USO still does this today, at least putting on the shows. Now they don't really have the women who are supposed to entertain the men. But this isn't as scandalous as it sounds. The women weren't even allowed to date the men. They were just basically supposed to help them, have someone to talk to, a new face, someone who wasn't a soldier, to basically just share some time with. And also, like I said, a lot of concerts, a lot of big names that would have been difficult for the soldiers to see during this time period came over with the USO. Another thing was that ethnic distinctions are starting to be blurred, partially because of the unity, partially because of just people are fighting together with people of different ethnicities, and really they basically start accepting people more so than they had in the past. Now, I'm not going to say that racism didn't exist, but I'm saying that it was less so than it had been previously. However, one group that was still experiencing prejudice was the Japanese. I mean, even a lot of times, German and Italian Americans, they weren't really the target of prejudice all that much. Not nearly so much, anyway, as the Japanese. People didn't... some soldiers tried to hide their German heritage or their Italian heritage, but people back home really didn't do that. Whereas the Japanese, pretty much everybody back home in America held negative feelings toward the Japanese. And they were referred to as dangerous. In fact, this is it's a paraphrase with some quotes in it, but basically they were referred to as so foreign that they could never become, quote, real Americans. And they were viewed as dangerous because a lot of people in America thought that the Japanese would be giving away secrets. They'd be giving away vital information and spying. So President Roosevelt in February 1942, authorized the army to put the Japanese, they relocated them. They took them from their homes, from their property, from their belongings, and put them in camps, basically prison camps, really. There's no nice way of saying this. It wasn't a good thing. They were put in a prison camp. They weren't allowed to leave. Now, they were allowed to farm and take care of things, but they were prisoners. And it didn't matter, for the most part, whether they were an American citizen. It didn't matter whether they were a naturalized citizen or whether they were a citizen who was born here. They were just relocated. And the Supreme Court upheld this. It was challenged in the Supreme Court in 1944. Korematsu versus the U.S. was a landmark case where the Supreme Court ruled that it's legally permissible to relocate the Japanese. Now, interestingly enough, it wasn't just Asians in general, because the Chinese, they used to be very big targets of discrimination. If you look back at the gold rush in California, people would just murder a Chinaman, as what they called him, Chinaman. They would murder a Chinese person because he was Chinese. Now, during World War II, Chinese people are serving in very large numbers in the military, whereas the Japanese are the targets now of the discrimination. So moving on really quickly, just to round out this section, last thing I want to talk to you about is the challenges to the New Deal. Basically, FDR wants to get some stuff done. He wants to get his vision of the war accomplished, but he has to sacrifice some of the New Deal for that. There's just not enough money to go around. So what ends up happening is the Republicans capitalize on this idea, like the New Deal is basically, it's the old deal now. Not trying to make a pun, but it's not new news anymore. It's really not needed because people's pay is going way through the roof. There's an abundance of things where really we've been pulled out of the Depression. But Roosevelt doesn't necessarily want to let go of some of the New Deal issues. But the Republicans, they make it a campaign issue. And they campaign Thomas Dewey against Roosevelt in the 1944 election on, this is part of the issue here. However, Roosevelt defeats Dewey, even though everybody thought that Dewey was going to at least have a good showing. But he only got 99 electoral votes. Roosevelt got 432 electoral votes against Dewey. So the people still supported Roosevelt, even though public opinion was moving away from some of the New Deal policies he passed in the past and some things he wanted to hang on to. So I'm going to leave us there for today. I'll be Skyping in here in a minute or two, and I'll talk to you then.